Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome back Althea Halchuk. She is a patient advocate. Today's Kevin MD article is titled The Old Man's Friend, Refuse Antibiotics to Achieve a Peaceful Death. Althea, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me again.
So Althea has been on multiple times. Go to kevinmd.com/podcast. Upper right-hand corner search icon, click on her name, click and search for her name for her prior episodes to hear her story. Today, let's jump right into your Kevin MD article, The Old Man's Friend, Refuse Antibiotics to Achieve a Peaceful Death. How did this particular article come together?
I've always been intrigued by that phrase, the old man's friend, and I began researching for Final Exit. I'm their surrogate consultant, and I do a lot of presentations for them. And so I checked it out as far as, well, what does it mean? Where does it come from? And people in late stages of life, basically on their deathbed, can forego antibiotics and have a peaceful death. And Osler, back 100 years ago, that was his phrase. He said it was the natural enemy of the old man because somebody was basically on their deathbed in a coma. And he didn't have antibiotics back then. So it was just a peaceful death. And when Bill Clinton went into the hospital probably about a year ago, he had sepsis. He didn't even know he had it. They gave him antibiotics and they brought him back. But it got me to thinking, I get a lot of requests from people like, I'm done with life. What can I do? I have all of these problems. I have no way that's legal. I don't live in a medical aid and dying state. Final Exit has a program, but it's not for everyone. And if somebody has some kind of infection and they forego antibiotics, it's a legal, quick. According to the sepsis organization, it progresses rapidly and is a fast killer. And so here we have these people who, instead of curing them with antibiotics, I'm thinking, well, if they decide they want to go, and I mean, this isn't for everyone. I'm not suggesting people do this as a way to commit suicide, nothing like that. This is when people are at the end of their life, basically on their deathbed, rather than keep being dragged back into living, which is not what they want, just forego the antibiotics. And I think what happens in a medical setting is it's the default. Somebody comes in with an infection, boom, they get antibiotics. And there's been a couple of wrongful life lawsuits around this where the last time I was on here, I talked about this dentist in New York who had stage 7 dementia. And while he had capacity, he said, no antibiotics. When I reached that stage, his wife said none. His post said none. His advance directive said none. And this doctor in the ER gave him antibiotics and brought him back to life. So now they have this big lawsuit in New York over antibiotics at end of life. So that's kind of how it started. And I just wanted to turn that thinking on its head. Like, instead of curing people, maybe it's a peaceful way to go.
Now, from the clinician standpoint, talk about the ethical considerations that they have to deal with when considering antibiotics at the end of life. What are the kind of the pros and cons? What are the ethical considerations that, in general, clinicians are faced with?
Well, I've studied bioethics a lot in law school, and I was on 2 bioethics committees. And for me, it's all about autonomy. It's about patient choice. And antibiotics and CPR, by the way, are 2 of the things where they don't have informed consent. Patients, they get them whether they want them or not. And I understand the clinicians wanting to save a life, but it's really up to the patient, the family, the advance directive. In the case of the dentist, he absolutely didn't want it. And he lived an extra few months. So to me, patients should be asked, is this what you really want? And I heard from a couple of people on about my blog that said, I was in the hospital with an infection. They didn't even ask me if I wanted an antibiotic. Yeah, they do want to save a life, but maybe they should be asking the patient what they want.
And from your experience, do you feel that that anecdote that you mentioned about the patient not even being asked whether they wanted antibiotics or not, is that common?
Oh, very. At end of life, when the most money Medicare spends is at end of life. And a lot of times it's on somebody that's in a nursing home. They get an infection, they bring them to the ER, they pump them full of antibiotics, and they send them back to the nursing home. A 99-year-old person who, do they ask the person? Probably not. Maybe the person doesn't have capacity, and so they're making this decision for them. But I think it happens all the time. I think that's the default is antibiotics.
Talk about that case that you mentioned, the wrongful life lawsuit, the Greenberg v. Montefiore Hospital. So, talk more about that case.
Sure. So Dr. Greenberg, he was diagnosed with dementia, and very early on, he did his advance directive. He made his wife his power of attorney, and he, at some stage, there was a post, whether or not his wife signed it or he signed it, but it absolutely said no antibiotics. When I can't recognize my family, don't keep me alive, let me go. So he was in a nursing home and something, he fell or something, and they bring him to the ER. And this ER doctor, now his wife is there, and she's saying no antibiotics.
Hmm.
His pulse, she handed him the pulse, no antibiotics. And this is all, you can look up the case and read about it. This is really what happened. And most of the time, doctors had, they weren't liable for anything they did when they're trying to save a life, but that's really changed. The new wave is, yes, you are liable if you don't follow the surrogate, if you don't follow the advance directive, if you go against a post, you're liable for that. So the family sued. And first it was thrown out of court because
Mm.
that's how it always was. And then finally, the last appeals court in New York, which was, I think, about a year ago, said, no, this case can go forward. You can sue this doctor and the hospital in New York for wrongful life because he was kept alive for a couple of extra months when he didn't need to be. They had to watch him suffer. He was curled up in a ball in the fetal position. If they'd have just let him go naturally, which is kind of the point of my article, it's a natural death. Why are we giving him antibiotics? So I have a feeling this case will settle this, and pretty much no question about it, because once a jury hears all of this, that they kept this poor guy alive for no good reason. When people are standing there telling him not to do this, and he does it anyway, the doctor, I mean, and he does it anyway.
This is one of several wrongful life cases that's currently being heard across
More
the
than
country.
several. And it all kind of started about maybe 10 years ago when there was a big case in Georgia. And this was putting a woman on a ventilator when she said absolutely not. The granddaughter was her power of attorney, and she sued and she won $1 million. And so that kind of opened the floodgates. And these cases are all over the country. Every single day, you hear about another one where somebody does something, puts in a feeding tube when somebody doesn't want it. And they're keeping people alive against their will. There's no discussion with the patient. It's, this is what I'm going to do, whether you like it or not. And so now people are pushing back on that. And it's not just several, it's a lot. It's once lawyers get their teeth into these kinds of cases, and really for the plaintiff's attorney, it's a long wait because you got to keep going through all of the state courts and then up to the appellate courts, and then it just keeps going and going. And they're all civil cases mostly, but it's, you're going to see more and more of it. And I think what will happen is lawyers and hospitals and insurance companies will say, well, wait a minute, we better start training people in the ED to say, does this person have an advance directive? Do they want CPR? Because that's another big thing that they do. Like they give a 99-year-old CPR when there's a DNR there. I mean, it boggles the mind how much this happens. And it happens every single day in every hospital all over the country. So once money kicks in and once lawyers kick in and say, you really need to do some in-house training here. The first thing is, does this person want to be full code, or do they want have a DNR? Do they want antibiotics or not? Antibiotics are treatment. And whatever happened to informed consent? It kind of falls by the wayside because whoever's in charge says, oh no, we have to do this.
Now, through your advocacy efforts as it relates to antibiotics, what kind of response do you get from the medical establishment?
I posted on LinkedIn, and one doctor was like all outraged about it, and I'm trying to kill people. And that thing could be further from the truth. I mean, I'm giving people a choice, which is what doctors are not doing. You want to do this, this is a method. It's one way of doing it. I wrote a blog on how to die. It started in Arizona because we don't have medical aid in dying. And there was a whole list of things. Die naturally. Well, because we have all this modern technology doesn't mean we need to use it. If people want to go, here's A, B, C, D, E, and refusing treatment, not just antibiotics, it's a lot of treatment, feeding tubes, ventilators. They keep people alive because they can, and to have no quality of life and be hooked up to machines in a hospital, I don't know anybody that wants that. So
So, share your ideal scenario in your ideal world. Let's say a patient comes to the emergency department, perhaps at their end or near their end of life, and they come in with symptoms suggestive of an infection. Walk us through what your ideal scenario would be.
if the person has a pulse or an advance directive, they should absolutely have that as their guide. If they come in with a surrogate or a power of attorney, or even a family member, if it's an older woman and her elder daughter comes in and knows what her mother wants, you should be asking that person. You shouldn't just be doing what you want to do. They've taken the patient out of the equation. And I think my ideal scenario is bring the patient back in, bring the family in, talk to them about what this person wants. We're going to try to give them antibiotics, and that's going to bring them back to go back to a nursing home where they have dementia. Do you want us to do that? It's so simple. Do you want us to keep them alive with no quality of life, on a ventilator, with a feeding tube? Do you want that? Do they want that? That's the important thing. It's the patient. It's what they want, how they want to live, their values. That's being left out in these discussions. So ideally, it would be a family meeting, and they would all talk about their mom and what she stood for, and conversations they've had with her through life. No, I'd never want to be hooked up to machines. I want to die at home, that kind of thing. I mean, it's sort of, because we can do it, we will do it. And I think that we need to get away from that kind of thinking.
Talk us through one of these conversations patients should have either with their families or their primary care physicians as it relates to some of these things that come up during end of life care. Could they say no to things like CPR and being hooked up to the feeding tube and yes to antibiotics? Or is it an all or nothing thing? So, talk us through some of the considerations patients should have when discussing their end of life wishes.
I don't think it's all or nothing, because pulse forms that I've read, and I've read quite a few of them, they're all different for every state. You can have some, you can have none, or you can have everything. And so it's really up to the person. I think what people see on TV with CPR is never how it really happens. CPR works in, I think I just read, 13% of the time with healthy people. So if you've got somebody that's not healthy, it's like 1% of the time. Show them a video of what happens when somebody's sternum breaks from CPR. They have this glorified version of it. If maybe they were given the facts, the guy that wrote The Conversation, I can't recall his name, but he developed videos with his doctor wife, he's also a doctor, to show people what these things look like. And when people saw what they looked like, they said, nah, give me a DNR. If I have to go through that, if I have to wake up practically brain dead, or with a broken sternum, or with my rib going through my lung, that's probably not for me. especially if I'm 90 years old or I'm 100 years old. They do it every day on people this age. And for what, I don't know. See, by the way, CPR is the default. I'm going a little off topic here, but I had a friend who brought her father to the emergency room. This was like the third or fourth time. He had a DNR. He had a signed DNR. When she brought him to the ER, that never really translated to his chart. And she looked at his chart and he was full code. And he had a brain bleed and he didn't want to be full code. And so she had to actually change it. And the Epic system defaults to full code. And I see that as a big problem because you're bringing your 95-year-old father into the ER because he's got a brain bleed. Who's thinking we have a DNR? He has it in his advance directive. You're thinking you're all set. And then all of a sudden you're not all set, and you don't find out until you see the doctor doing CPR and you look at his chart and it says full code. So I think that's kind of an issue too. Like, why aren't we listening to patients? Why helping them understand what some of these treatments do?
Now, with antibiotics specifically, what kind of questions should patients or their surrogates ask themselves whether they should receive or whether they should want to receive antibiotics in their end of life orders?
Well, in the case of the doctor, do you want to be kept alive if you have dementia and you don't recognize your family? Do you want to be kept alive if you have congestive heart failure and you're all bloated and you know what it looks like, you're a doctor? Do you want to be kept alive in those circumstances? These are the conversations people need to have with primary care doctor and the attending that they're not having. People, doctors don't want to talk about death, but for some people, death is welcome. And sometimes they just don't get it. So I think it depends on the patient, on their health condition, whether they've said, you know what, I've had enough. My 95-year-old aunt was diagnosed with colon cancer. They wanted to give her a colonoscopy. Like, what? We know she has colon. Are we going to change what we do going down the road if we do a colonoscopy and she survives, by the way, at 95? Are we going to change the treatment? No, because she didn't want treatment. So it's things like that where it almost is like a reflex with medical staff that, okay, we're going to do this because we have to find out that. So really, you need to know what the person's condition is and kind of go from there, have the conversation with the people.
We're talking to Althea Halchuk. She's a patient advocate. Today's Kevin MD article is titled The Old Man's Friend, Refuse Antibiotics to Achieve a Peaceful Death. Althea, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Kind of my take-home messages, I guess, would be for both doctors and patients, but mostly patients and families. If you have to advocate for yourself, there are lots of patient advocates around, but we charge a fee for that. But we tell you, advocate for yourself. If somebody says, oh, we just, they come in the room, they don't even tell you what they're doing. I've been in enough hospital settings, and they come in with a bag and they stick it up and it's full of antibiotics, but you don't know that. You need to ask, what is it you're doing? What's in the bag? What do you hope to accomplish? Why haven't you asked me if it's something I want or not? And granted, they're busy, busy, busy people, nurses especially. They run the hospital basically, and it's all about time and money. They don't have time to go through it all, but you need to make them, because informed consent is your right. It's a federal law that you're allowed to hear the information, digest it, see if it's for you. It's all about patient autonomy. And again, the patient is being left out. So the family has to stand up and speak for the patient if they can't speak for themselves.
Althea, thank you so much again for coming back on the show, sharing your time and insight.
Thank you, Kevin.